My name is Nadia, and the moment I understood everything, every fight, every misunderstanding, every time Daniel looked at me like I was the unreasonable one, I was standing in my mother-in-law's kitchen holding a phone that wasn't mine. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I was looking for a pen. The phone was sitting face up on the counter, and the screen was already lit, and the message on it was from my husband, sent 3 minutes earlier while he was sitting right next to me in the living room. I read it twice. Then I put the phone down exactly where I found it, walked back into the living room, sat down beside my husband, and smiled at something his aunt was saying. And for the next 4 hours, while his family ate and laughed and passed dishes around the table, I sat with what I had just read, and I made a decision that would change every single thing about the next chapter of my life. I just had to wait for the right moment. And I have always, my whole life, been very good at waiting. Before I tell you what that message said, I need to take you back to the beginning because none of it makes sense without the beginning. My name is Nadia. I am 41 years old. I was married to a man named Daniel for 9 years. And for most of those 9 years, I genuinely believed the problem in our marriage was me. That I was too sensitive, too demanding, not understanding enough of the pressures he was under, the loyalty he felt to his family, the complicated history that made him the way he was. I had been told this in one form or another so many times and by so many people I trusted that it had started to feel like a fact about myself rather than a story someone else was writing about me. That's the part I want every woman listening to this to really sit with, because I was not a difficult woman. I was a woman who had been very carefully taught to believe she was. Daniel and I met at a work event 11 years ago. He was funny, attentive, the kind of man who listened when you talked. Actually listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak. We dated for 2 years before he proposed, and during those 2 years, his mother, Vera, was perfectly pleasant to me. Warm even. She remembered what I ordered at restaurants. She asked about my work. She sent me a birthday card the first year we were together. Handwritten, which I kept because it felt like being accepted. I know now, with the clarity of everything that came after, that those 2 years were Vera on her best behavior because she hadn't decided yet whether she could get rid of me. Once she decided she couldn't, she changed strategy entirely. She stopped trying to drive me away and started trying to make me impossible to live with instead. And she was very, very good at it. The first thing she did, which I didn't recognize as a thing she did until years later, was make herself the person Daniel called first. Not second, not when he needed his mother specifically, first. Before he called me back when I had left a message, before he made a decision about our apartment, our plans, our finances. Vera somehow always knew about things in our life before I had fully processed them myself. And at the time, I told myself that was just the kind of close relationship they had. A lot of women have that with their mothers. Daniel was her youngest, her only son, and I understood that bond. What I didn't understand yet was that the closeness wasn't organic anymore. It was being maintained deliberately by a woman who understood that the best way to stay at the center of her son's life was to make sure she was always the most reliable person in it. And to do that, she needed me to be unreliable. It started small enough that I genuinely couldn't prove any of it, which I now understand was the entire point. A dinner reservation I'd made that Daniel somehow thought was for a different night. A conversation I'd told him about that he swore I'd never had with him. A plan with friends he said I'd never mentioned, that I had mentioned, that I had the text message proving I'd mentioned. And even then, the disagreement somehow ended up with me apologizing. There is a specific kind of self-doubt that sets in when the person you love most consistently remembers your life differently than you do. You start checking yourself, rewinding conversations in your head before you go to sleep, trying to figure out where you went wrong, whether you'd really said what you thought you'd said, whether you were as reliable as you believed yourself to be. That self-doubt was not an accident. It was being engineered. I just hadn't figured out yet by whom or how or why. That part took years. By year 3 of our marriage, Daniel and I were fighting more often than not. Not screaming fights, quieter than that, more exhausting. The kind of low-grade friction where nothing ever fully resolves and both of you go to bed with the residue of it still sitting in the room. He thought I was paranoid. I thought he wasn't listening. Neither of us understood what was actually happening, which was that we were reacting to two completely different versions of our shared life. His version had been quietly shaped by conversations I wasn't part of, and mine was the version where I kept noticing things that didn't add up. I suggested couples therapy. He agreed, but when I found a therapist and gave him the dates, he said his mother had mentioned she didn't think therapy was the right move, that it could create problems where there weren't any, and maybe we should just take a trip together instead. I remember sitting with that response for a very long time, wondering at what point I had started sharing our marriage with his mother, and not being able to pinpoint when exactly it had happened. The therapist thing is what I keep coming back to, even now, because it was the first moment I can point to where I felt something shift in me, from frustrated to suspicious. Not suspicious of Daniel, not yet. Suspicious of the architecture of our life. Because when I thought about it honestly, Vera had been present in one way or another for nearly every turning point in our marriage. She was there when we decided not to move to the city like we'd planned, because Daniel mentioned she'd been worried about us being so far from family. She was there when I lost the consulting job I'd been building toward for 2 years, and Daniel suggested, somehow, that maybe it was for the best, that I'd been spreading myself too thin, which was almost word for word what Vera had said at dinner 2 weeks earlier. Small things, deniable things. But when I lined them up in my head in order, they stopped looking like coincidences. They started looking like a pattern. And patterns have a source. I want to tell you about the woman Vera was in public, because it matters for understanding how invisible all of this stayed for so long. In public, Vera was the kind of mother-in-law women envied. She brought food when we were busy. She showed up to things that mattered. She referred to me as her daughter in front of her friends in a way that made those friends coo and squeeze my arm. She said the right things at the right times, and she said them so naturally that even I believed them in the moments they were happening. People who met her at family gatherings would corner me afterward and tell me how lucky I was. And I would smile and agree and carry home every single time a low, private confusion that I couldn't fully explain to anyone, including myself. Because the woman they were describing was also real. She existed. She just wasn't the only version of Vera there was. Year 5 was when the money became an issue. Daniel had been passed over for a promotion he'd been working toward for almost 3 years, and the financial pressures started showing in ways that bled into everything else. I was working, contributing, doing what I thought was building something together. But somehow, around this time, we started having conversations about our spending where I could never get the numbers to match. Small amounts unaccounted for, here and there. When I brought it up, Daniel said I was being controlling about money. I let it go. Then, I found a receipt from a restaurant neither of us had been to and a florist charge on a card that was supposed to be for household expenses. When I asked about it, Daniel told me it was for his mother's birthday, which had been 2 months before the charge. When I pointed that out, the conversation ended the same way so many of our conversations ended, with me feeling unreasonable for asking, and no actual answer given. I still don't fully know what that charge was for. I have my suspicions now, but at the time, I just filed it under another thing that didn't add up and went back to trying to be easier to live with. The clear sign I missed, and I genuinely grieve this one, looking back, was my friendship with a woman named Sasha, who had been one of my closest friends before I married Daniel. Sasha was warm and direct, and had known me since before I'd become the quieter, more careful version of myself that the marriage had gradually produced. Over time, without me fully tracking it, Sasha and I drifted. Phone calls got shorter, plans fell through more often. I assumed it was life, the natural friction of adult friendships when everyone is busy and tired. Then, about a year ago, Sasha told me something at dinner. She said that years earlier at her wedding reception, Vera had pulled her aside and told her that I had confided privately that I found Sasha exhausting, that I was only maintaining the friendship out of obligation, and that I'd said I needed space. Sasha had believed it, because why wouldn't she? Because it came from my mother-in-law. Because who does that? I had never said anything of the sort, not one single word. But for years, the friendship had been quietly bleeding out on the basis of something I never said to a woman I had never spoken to about any of it. I sat at that dinner table with Sasha, and I kept my voice completely even, and I asked her to tell me every detail of that conversation. She did, including where it happened, what Vera was wearing, the exact phrasing she used. Sasha apologized multiple times, and I told her, honestly, that she had nothing to apologize for. Then I went home, and I sat in the dark of our bedroom while Daniel slept, and I did something I had not done in years. I started listing things. Not in a dramatic way, not a wall covered in string like a detective movie, just a note on my phone, a plain list of every moment over 9 years where something had gone wrong in my marriage in a way that had made me feel responsible, and where I could now, looking back with fresh eyes, see Vera's shape somewhere in the edges of it. It took me an hour and a half. The list was long, and every item on it, standing alone, was deniable. But nothing that long is a coincidence. Nothing that consistent is accidental. I just didn't have proof yet. The next 3 months, I spent paying a different kind of attention. Not obvious attention, nothing that would change my behavior enough for anyone to notice. I kept everything the same on the surface. The dinners, the family visits, the careful pleasantness I had refined over 9 years into something nearly automatic. But underneath, I was watching. Specifically, I was watching the gap between what Vera said to my face and what happened in my marriage in the days that followed. It was shocking how quickly the pattern became visible once I was actually looking for it. A Sunday visit where Vera mentioned gently that I seemed stressed lately, followed within the week by Daniel asking me if I was doing okay, in the specific way that means he'd been primed to worry. A phone call she made to Daniel on his way home from work that I could see on the shared location app always coincided with the evenings he came home already distant and closed off. She was a tuner. She didn't have to say much. She just turned dials quietly from her end and watched what shifted on mine. I decided I needed to understand the full picture before I did anything, not because I was afraid, but because I had learned, the hard way, that reacting to incomplete information was exactly what the situation had been trained to produce in me for 9 years. So I was methodical. I called Sasha and I asked if she'd be willing to write down exactly what Vera had said to her at the wedding, and she did, in a long, careful text she'd said she'd been holding on to for years. I called my sister, who had always had a complicated feeling about Vera that she'd never fully explained to me, and I asked her to explain it now. She did. She described a conversation with Vera from before Daniel and I were even engaged, in which Vera had asked her, very casually, whether she thought I was the kind of woman who could handle the reality of being part of a family like ours. Not whether I was a good person, not whether I made Daniel happy, whether I was the kind of woman who could handle it. My sister had never told me because she hadn't wanted to start trouble. And there it was. Vera had started her work before the ring was even on my finger. Now I want to tell you about the phone, because this is where the story stops being about slow, painful discovery and becomes about something else entirely. It was a Sunday dinner at Vera's house, the kind that happened once a month and that I had attended for 9 years with a smile so practiced it barely required any effort anymore. Daniel and I were sitting in the living room with his aunt and cousin while Vera was in the kitchen. I offered to help with something and she waved me off the way she always did, so I went looking for a pen to write down a recipe she'd mentioned. Her phone was on the counter, screen up, already lit. I wasn't looking for anything, but the message on the screen was from Daniel's contact name, and it said in plain language that he was worried the conversation last week had gone too far and that maybe they should be more careful about how they handled things going forward. Last week, Daniel and I had our worst fight in years about something that now I could barely even reconstruct the origin of. I put the phone down, I walked back into the living room, and I smiled. What I felt in that moment was not what you might expect. It wasn't rage, not the hot, immediate kind. What I felt more than anything was a specific and devastating clarity, the kind that arrives when the last piece of something slides into place and suddenly the whole shape of it becomes visible. 9 years of feeling crazy, of feeling unreasonable, of apologizing for being too sensitive and too suspicious and too demanding, all of it resolved into about 30 seconds into a single, simple truth. I had not been any of those things. I had been right. Right about the pattern, right about the source, right about the fact that my marriage had not been failing because of anything broken in me. It had been failing because someone had been working very consistently for a very long time to make sure it did. And the only question left, the one that I turned over quietly in my head for the next 4 hours while I ate Vera's food and laughed at the right moments, was what exactly I was going to do about it. I did not confront Daniel that night. I want you to understand why, because I think it matters. It wasn't because I was afraid. It wasn't because I was unsure. It was because I had spent 9 years reacting in the moment to things I didn't have the full picture on. And every single time I had done that, I had ended up looking like the problem. So this time, I was going to have everything first. Every thread, every piece, every bit of evidence assembled and ready before I said a word to anyone. I went home that Sunday night, and I made a separate email account on my phone, something Vera had never seen and Daniel didn't know existed. And I started a document. Everything I had. Every conversation Sasha remembered, every item from my list, my sister's account of what Vera had said before the engagement, and now at the top of it, the message I had read on that kitchen counter. I wrote it down word for word from memory while it was still fresh. Then I locked the document, put my phone in my bag, and went to bed beside my husband. And I slept better than I had in years. Over the following 2 weeks, I gathered the rest of it quietly and without anyone noticing. I asked Sasha to put her account in writing, which she did gladly, in 3 paragraphs that were more precise and damning than anything I could have written myself. I called Daniel's cousin, a woman named Petra, who'd been present at enough family events over the years to have her own observations. And over coffee, I asked her carefully what she actually thought of the way Vera talked about me when I wasn't in the room. Petra was quiet for a long moment. Then she said she'd always been uncomfortable with it, that Vera had a habit of reframing things Nadia had done or said in ways that made Daniel's family quietly worried about her, that she'd always assumed it was just how Vera processed stress. But now that someone was actually asking her out loud, she said, she'd say it clearly. Vera talked about me the way a person talks about something they're waiting to be rid of. Not with cruelty exactly, with patience. Like I was a problem she was managing on a long timeline. Petra offered to say any of that again formally to whomever needed to hear it. I want to be honest about something I felt during this period because I think it's the part most women listening will recognize most immediately. Mixed in with the clarity and the building certainty and the quiet, methodical work of assembling everything I needed, mixed in with all of that was grief. Real, heavy, sitting in the chest grief. Not for the loss of Vera, because you cannot lose someone you never actually had, but grief for the version of my marriage I'd believed in for 9 years. For the Daniel I thought I knew when I was standing at the altar. For all the arguments I'd apologized my way out of that I should never have apologized for. All the space I'd made for myself to be smaller so that no one would accuse me of being difficult. You don't get those years back. You don't unsay the apologies or unlearn the self-doubt. And sitting with the proof of what had actually been happening, I had to grieve that version of my life before I could fully step into whatever came next. I gave myself exactly 1 week to do that, then I packed the grief away and I got back to work. I need to tell you about Daniel's family reunion, because that's where this ends. And you need to understand what this event was before you understand why I chose it. The Whittemore family reunion happened every 2 years at Vera's sister's property, a large house with a big back lawn, and it was the event Vera cared about more than any other. Her standing in that family, her identity as the matriarch, the woman everyone deferred to and admired, all of it was concentrated in those 2 days. It was where she held court, where she was most herself, most powerful, most visible to the people whose opinion she cared about. The next one was 6 weeks away. I had started gathering evidence 3 weeks ago. That gave me 3 more weeks to finish what I was building, and a venue that would have every person who mattered to Vera in the same place at the same time. I wasn't going to waste it. I had spent 9 years being invisible in this family. I was only going to do this once, and I was going to do it where she couldn't contain the fallout. During those final 3 weeks, I did something I hadn't done in almost a decade. I reached out to people. Not loudly, not in any way that would flag what was coming. Just small, quiet reconnections with people in Daniel's family who I had always sensed were uncomfortable with how Vera operated, but had never found a reason to say so out loud. Petra was already with me. There was also Daniel's uncle Raymond, who had a long, complicated history with Vera that he'd never fully explained, but that anyone paying attention could feel in every room they shared. I didn't ask Raymond directly for anything. I just had coffee with him. And I asked him, genuinely, what he thought had gone wrong in our marriage. And he told me something that made the room go very quiet around me. He said he'd watched Vera do this before. Not to the same person, not in the same way, but to others in the family who had gotten too close to people she felt threatened by. He said very carefully that he had always thought someone would eventually figure it out. And he looked at me in a way that told me he was glad it had turned out to be me. The week before the reunion, I sat down with Daniel. Not with everything, not yet. Just with a single question, asked plainly and without accusation, because I needed to understand, before I did anything else, how much he actually knew. I told him I needed to ask him something, and I needed him to answer honestly. I asked him how often he and his mother talked about our marriage. He was quiet for a long moment, and that pause told me more than the answer would. He said they talked sometimes, that she was his mother and he was close with her. I understood that, and I was asking specifically about the last few years, about whether their conversations had influenced how he felt about me or decisions he'd made with me. He said she was just looking out for him. I knew. And then I said, as quietly and carefully as I have ever said anything in my life, that I needed him to understand something. That what I was about to show him at the reunion was not about hurting him. It was about making sure everyone finally saw the same thing at the same time. He didn't fully understand what I meant. I didn't explain further. I knew that if I told him everything beforehand, Vera would know within hours, because that was how their relationship had always worked, and I had no reason to believe this moment would be different. So I let him sit with the unease of that conversation, and I went and I finished my preparations. I want to tell you what those preparations looked like, because I think people expect revenge to be dramatic and loud, and it almost never is. Not the kind that actually lands. What I had was a folder on my phone containing a screenshot of the message I'd read on Vera's counter, the written accounts from Sasha and Petra, a summary of what Raymond had shared with me, and a 4-year pattern of dates and events that, laid out in order, told a story that was completely clear. I didn't need confrontation. I didn't need a speech. I just needed to hand that folder to the right people in the right room at the right moment. And Vera had been providing me the venue for years. The reunion fell on a Saturday. We arrived mid-morning and the lawn was already full. 3 generations of Vera's family spread across folding chairs and picnic blankets, the kind of gathering where everyone is warm and loud and the food comes out before noon and stays until sunset. Vera moved through it the way she always did at these things, unhurried and certain, the gravitational center of the afternoon. She greeted me with a hug and held it a beat longer than usual, which I noticed and filed away. She did that sometimes when she was pleased with herself. I'd seen it at every family event where something had recently shifted in a way that benefited her. I hugged her back. I told her the garden looked beautiful. I meant neither thing. I went and found Raymond, who gave me a small nod from across the lawn, and then I found Petra, who squeezed my hand and didn't say anything. And then I found a chair near the center of everything, and I sat down and I waited, the way I have always been good at waiting, for the moment to arrive. It arrived the way the best moments do, naturally. After lunch, when the food had been cleared and people were settling into the slow, easy part of the afternoon, Vera stood up to make a toast. She did this at every reunion, had done it for years. A few words about family and love and the people they'd lost and the ones they were grateful for. I'd watched her do it 7 times, and each time she was polished and warm, and the whole lawn went quiet to listen to her. She started the same way this time. I let her get through the first 2 sentences. Then I stood up too. I didn't shout, I didn't interrupt exactly. I just stood, which was enough because Vera was not a woman accustomed to anyone standing when she was speaking. The lawn went the particular kind of quiet that happens when something unexpected interrupts something expected. I said, clearly and calmly, that I hoped she'd let me add something before she continued, that I had something I'd been meaning to share with the family for a while, and this felt like the right occasion. Vera's face moved through 3 expressions in about 2 seconds. Surprise, then something that looked like amusement, then something underneath the amusement that was neither. She gestured for me to go ahead, in the gracious way of someone who does not believe for a single second that anything about to happen is a real threat. That gesture, more than anything, is what I will remember about the beginning of that afternoon. I spoke for about 4 minutes. I didn't raise my voice once. I told the family that I had been married to Daniel for 9 years, that I had loved their family and tried to be a real part of it, and that I had recently understood some things about that time I felt they deserved to know. I said I wasn't there to be dramatic, only honest. Then I read, from my phone, the message Vera had received from Daniel's phone the night after our worst fight of the year. I said the name of the person who had written down the conversation at our wedding. I named what Vera had said to my sister before the engagement. I named the pattern in order by year. I said all of it the way you'd read the summary of something you'd already made peace with. Not angrily, not tearfully, just clearly, just as a set of facts offered in a room full of people who had the right to have them. And when I finished, I sat back down, and I waited for the silence to do the rest of the work. I want to tell you what happened in that silence, because it wasn't what I expected, and I think it was more powerful than anything I could have planned. Nobody laughed. Nobody told me I was wrong. Vera started to speak. She said my name in the tone of someone who was about to begin a very careful reframe. But Raymond said from across the lawn, and clearly and without standing up, "Let her finish, Vera." Vera stopped. Raymond had never spoken to her like that in the 20 years I'd known him, and everyone at that reunion had seen enough of their history to understand the weight of it. In the 5 seconds that followed, I watched something happen to Vera's face that I had never seen happen before in 9 years of watching her perform in rooms. She lost her composure. Not dramatically, just the edges of it. Just enough that the people who loved her and knew her best could see that the expression she was wearing now was not something she had chosen. It was something that had arrived uninvited. And once people see that in a person, they cannot unsee it. Daniel left with me. I did not expect that, and I want to be honest about what I mean when I say it. He didn't leave in a way that was triumphant or certain. He left the way someone leaves when the ground has shifted under them so completely that staying in the same place was no longer physically possible. He said once that he hadn't known how much of it she'd been doing. I said I believed him. I wasn't sure I fully did, not yet. But I believe he believed it, and that distinction mattered enough to me to say out loud.
The marriage did not survive. I want to tell you that plainly, because I know what women listening to stories like this are hoping for, and I don't want to pretend the ending is tidier than it was. We tried. We spent 4 months in therapy with a woman who was excellent and patient, and who helped us both understand things about the dynamic we'd been living in that we couldn't have articulated before. But the 9 years between us had happened the way they had happened. And there's a specific kind of damage that comes from spending a decade not trusting the person you trusted most, even when he didn't know he was doing it. He had not been her instrument on purpose, but he had been her instrument. And knowing that intellectually doesn't undo the feeling of it in your body, in the muscle memory of 1,000 conversations that ended with you apologizing for something you didn't do. The marriage did not survive. The version of myself that I rebuilt after it did. Vera called me once, about 2 months after the reunion. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail that I have listened to 3 times and probably will not listen to again. It wasn't an apology, not really. It was an explanation, which is a different thing. She talked about how much she loved Daniel, how she had only ever wanted to protect him, how she hoped I could understand that even if she'd gone about it the wrong way, her heart had been in the right place. I sat with that voicemail for a while. I understand the human impulse to believe that good intentions excuse harmful patterns, because I've felt that impulse myself. But I've also lived for 9 years inside the results of those intentions. A mother's love does not get to be the reason her daughter-in-law spends a decade doubting her own reality. The reason and the result are not in the same category, and framing one as the other does not make them equivalent. I did not call her back. I want to tell you about Sasha, because she deserves her own moment in this story. We're closer now than we were before any of this happened, which I did not expect and which still surprises me sometimes when I sit with it. There is a specific kind of bond that forms between two women when they discover together that they were both deceived by the same person and that neither of them was wrong to trust the other. We had coffee last month, and she said something I keep thinking about. She said the hardest part for her had not been finding out what Vera had told her. It had been realizing how quickly she had believed it, how little it had taken to make her quietly doubt a friendship she'd had for 15 years. She said she thought women were trained to believe the worst about each other faster than they should, and that people who understood that training used it as a weapon. She wasn't wrong. And I think about that every time I catch myself being too quick to accept a bad story about another woman from a source with something to gain. Daniel and I finalized our divorce about 8 months after the reunion. The process was, by most standards, civil. He was not malicious, not vindictive, and I believe, genuinely, that the months of therapy had clarified things for him that he hadn't been able to see before. He told me once in one of our last sessions that he was sorry for the specific thing that was hardest to apologize for, which wasn't the individual moments or even the sum of them, but the years of making me feel like I was the problem when the problem was something he'd been too close to see clearly. I accepted that apology, not because it erased anything, but because holding on to the resentment of it would cost me far more than it would ever cost him. And I had already spent 9 years in this family paying prices that weren't mine to pay.
What I want to tell you now is what I learned about myself. Not about Vera or Daniel or any of them, because ultimately, those people are not the reason I'm telling this story. I am telling it because of who I was before all of this. A woman who was capable, perceptive, fundamentally solid. And how efficiently and quietly that woman can be worn down when the right pressure is applied consistently enough over enough time. I stopped trusting my own instincts somewhere in year 3 of that marriage, and I didn't fully realize I'd lost them until year 9, when I was standing in a kitchen holding a stranger's phone, and suddenly my instincts came back all at once, so clearly it almost knocked me sideways. That's the thing I will not let happen again. Not because I'll be suspicious of everyone, not because I'll close myself off from love or family, because I will never again allow someone else's consistent retelling of my own experience to become the version I believe. People ask me, fairly often, whether I feel guilty about the reunion, whether standing up in front of that family and saying what I said caused damage to people who weren't responsible for what Vera did. It's a fair question, and I've thought about it seriously. What I know is this: every person at that reunion who loved Vera also deserved to see her clearly, not because she owed them a perfect image, but because they had been making decisions about me, about our marriage, about what kind of woman I was, based on years of information that had been quietly shaped by someone with an agenda. They deserved to have access to the same facts I had. What they chose to do with those facts was their own business. Some of them pulled back from Vera afterward. Some of them, I think, have gone back to exactly the version of her they preferred to believe. That's their choice. I only had control over whether the truth was in the room. After that, it belonged to everyone. I moved into a small apartment about a year ago, and I have spent that year doing something I had forgotten how to do, living at my own pace, making plans and having them be the plans, calling Sasha and not having that call mean something it wasn't supposed to mean, waking up in the morning in a space that is entirely mine without anyone's interpretation of me already waiting there when I open my eyes. I don't tell this story because I need Vera to be a villain. She is a complicated person who loved her son in a way that became a weapon. And that's both true at the same time. And it doesn't require me to forgive her to hold both of those things together. I tell this story because somewhere out there is a woman lying awake at 3 a.m, rewinding conversations, wondering if she's the problem.
apologizing for things she didn't do, slowly becoming a quieter and smaller version of who she started out as. This story is for her. Your instincts are not the problem. Trust them. They were never wrong.